Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to give you an update on where we are in terms of our watershed implementation plan as it relates to Maryland agriculture. I'm just going to get right into the slides because I have a lot to present in a short period of time. So I'm going to basically go over these 5 points. How's our Bay responding to our efforts so far? What programs have brought us this far? What the remaining gaps are? How we plan to address those gaps, and more importantly, why most of you are here to hear about what Ag is doing to meet our responsibilities in Phase 3. So as most of you are probably aware, back in 2009, the total maximum daily load, or TMDL, was established for the Chesapeake Bay. It required states to develop plans to reduce the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment that is released to the Chesapeake Bay and to still attain a certain water quality standard. That's based on dissolved oxygen levels. So 2017 represents the midway point for us in achieving our goal by 2025. So this was an opportunity to really take a minute to assess where we are in terms of our goals out to 2025, but more importantly, to maybe enhance or to better inform our process moving forward by way of a better Chesapeake Bay model that is essentially the scorecard that we're using to gauge success. So better science, better information has been included into the Chesapeake Bay model. We have new planning targets or new goals that we have to meet by 2025. So it really this is the second half of our process, but really it's going to get us to our goal line by 2025. So how's the Bay responding to efforts so far? Well, obviously, looking at living resources, the amount of bay grasses continue to increase, blue crab populations, and even the oyster, the living resources continue to flourish in the Chesapeake Bay. The University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, or UMSES, released a report card to the Chesapeake Bay for 2017, and we actually made sea this year, which is the first time ever I think we actually got to sea level. So we're improving, and the green arrow there shows that we're continuing to improve. And you can see where the individual watersheds within the bay are responding to our efforts so far. So a lot of the watersheds are moving in the right direction. So we are hopefully at a tipping point where we can continue to receive restoration efforts beyond 2025. So great story so far. We are making progress. So how are we doing in terms of that? What programs have brought us this far? Well, there are three main sectors, if you will, that are contributing to load reductions or load pollution to the Chesapeake Bay. Wastewater treatment plants obviously is a huge impact. The Bay Restoration Fund, or the flush fee that most of us know it as, dedicated a large pot of money to upgrade our wastewater treatment plants. 65 of the 67 of the major wastewater treatment plants have been upgraded so far. Huge load reductions as a result of that. Agriculture, obviously, we have a large amount of load reductions as well. This is primarily due to our cost share programs like our Maryland Agricultural Cost Share Program, our cover crop program, etc. But we also do have some regulatory programs in place, such as our nutrient management and PMT. So a lot of good work has been done in the ag sector, and it's important to note that this didn't start in 2009, that we've been at this for quite some time. Our MAX program, for instance, has been around since 1985. So a lot of implementation has occurred over the years in terms of ag. Urban stormwater, obviously through the MS4 permitting process, the Phase 1 and Phase 2s, there's been some load reductions associated with that as well. So where are we? In 1985, if you look at the size of the pie, that was the amount of nitrogen being released by Maryland. And you can see where the various, well, actually the sectors don't show here, do they? Yeah, they've been cut off. Well, I can tell you where they are. Let me stand up here for a second. If you can still hear me. So the red represents wastewater, blue represents agriculture, green is natural, and I think yellow is urban, if I'm not mistaken. So that's the breakout of loads for nitrogen to the Chesapeake in 1985. Since then, there's been major reductions in wastewater and agriculture. So it's about a 2/3 to 1/3 mix between load reductions between those two major sectors. So wastewater, 2/3 of our nitrogen load reduction so far, and 1/3 coming from ag. So this is where we are currently in 2017. So you can see that the wastewater slice of the pie has shrunk quite a bit. Urban has come as far as we hoped, but agriculture is still about a third of the pie to go in terms of load reduction. Similar chart for phosphorus. Again, the take-home message is that wastewater and agriculture have carried the load reductions for Maryland in terms of our strategy. For ag specifically, we developed a plan back in 2011, 2012. This is our WIP 2 plan. Essentially, we looked at all of the practices that were available to us in terms of load reduction to the Chesapeake for ag. So this is essentially a Chinese menu of 2 pages worth of practices. Some of these are annual practices, such as conservation planning, cover crops, things of that sort, tillage. Others are structural in nature, like our riparian forest buffers, grass buffers, waste storage structures, etc. All of these practices help contribute to load reductions to the Chesapeake Bay. So we developed this plan. This is our WIP 2 plan. Pretty straightforward. 2 pages of goals out to 2025 in terms of how many acres of cover crop we think we can implement by 2025, how many riparian buffers, etc. So this is our plan. And that met our strategy for ag for 2025 back then. So how are we doing here? This was our progress in 1985. This is for nitrogen delivered to the bay for agriculture now. So back in 85, ag was responsible for about 28 million pounds being released to the Chesapeake Bay. And before we even got to the TMDL, we had reduced that down to 19.6. Just through our voluntary efforts, through our cost share programs. And then since the TMDL, we've been making steady decreases, and we're at 17.5. Our target for 2017 was 17 million, so we were about 500,000 pounds short in meeting our goal for agriculture. So we were on track, a little short, but overall heading in the right direction. So we feel that we are making progress that we need to out to 2025. But this was based on the old model. Again, we're now implementing this new model, phase 6 of the model, so some of the numbers have changed a little bit. But overall, good progress. If you look at this chart for similar states, for agriculture, the implementation levels aren't going to be as high. I mean, the bars would be much closer to the 85 level in some of the other states compared to us. So huge reductions from ag. In terms of other highlights for implementation, we have over 900,000 acres in conservation planning. This is our backbone of what we do. These are our conservation districts, our planners and technicians working with individual farmers to identify resource concerns on those farms and to implement practices to address those concerns. So 900,000 out of 1.2, 1.3 million acres of agricultural land in Maryland. So we have a huge coverage for that. Over 800,000 in compliance with nutrient management. That's based on just a compliance ratio or a compliance rate that we apply to that. Last year represented another record year for cover crop enrollments. Almost 560,000 acres of cover crops were enrolled in the state, and we almost have 800,000 acres in conservation tillage. So huge practices, numbers of practices that are being implemented on agricultural land. And obviously we have other programmatic highlights such as our PMT regulations that have taken effect, Animal Waste Technology Fund, Manure Matching Service, and others. Nutrient trading was mentioned earlier with oysters. Obviously that's nutrient trading in the ag sector is something that we can anticipate growing forward. So where are these remaining gaps? So this is for all of Maryland now, just not Maryland ag. So in 2009, our progress for Maryland as a whole was 57.5 million pounds. We got it down to 54.2 by 2017. Our phase 2 goal that was established back then for us to meet was 47.1 million pounds total for nitrogen. As a result of some changes in the model and better information within the model, our new target is 45.8. So not only do we have to meet our goal that we had established back in 2011, but we have to do 1.3 million pounds more than what we thought we had to do back then. So that's another gap that we have to close that none of us have accounted for. So that's going to have to be developed, or we're going to have to absorb that or incorporate that into our WIP 3 out to 2025. And that's just not all Maryland ag, that's all of Maryland. So that includes the wastewater, septic, and urban stormwater into that 1.3 as well. So how do we plan on addressing this? Well, obviously looking at the different sectors, the Maryland Department of the Environment will continue to work with the wastewater treatment plants to increase their performance on some of the minor wastewaters, et cetera. Septic system upgrades, urban stormwater through the MS4 permits, whether it's the phase 1 or phase 2, a lot of those are coming up for revisions at this point. For us, for ag, we're going to look at that WIP 2 strategy, that Chinese menu of practices, and reevaluate that. And in fact, we've done that already to make sure that we're meeting our obligations. There's some new tools that are available to us now that we're looking at. The Clean Water Commerce Act, there's a carve out of the Bay Restoration funds that the state can use to purchase credit reduction or nutrient reductions outright. Pay for performance type modeling approaches we're looking into, and then future considerations, obviously climate change, climate resiliency, aligning for growth as more people come into the watershed, how we're going to deal with those loads, et cetera. And then finally, crediting conservation, so making sure that we take advantage of all that land that was set aside through program open space or through our ag land preservation program, et cetera, making sure that that's all credited appropriately in the model. Our task was to develop local planning goals at each of the, basically at a county level for each of the major sectors. So we are working through that process with our partners over the Department of the Environment to have local plans developed that will assist us in meeting our goals. Our strategy statewide is to compile, we've been working on this, compile working inventories within each of those counties to evaluate how much has been done, how much more can be done in each of those sectors. There's a series of regional workshops. In fact, the first one is next week, where we're going to sit down with the local stakeholders to review the draft plan that we've put together already. And then come early next year, we're going to work through the process within the leadership within Maryland government through the Chesapeake Bay Cabinet, where all the cabinet secretaries will get together to review the plan and sign off on that. We'll release it hopefully April of 2019 for a 60-day public comment period, and then our final draft or our final report or final WIP is due August of 2019. So I'm going to talk real quickly about the ag sector. So how are we going to get to this goalpost of 2025? Well, it's really looking at what we've done already, making sure that we're accounting for everything that we've done without asking folks to do more. So we want to make sure that we fully account for all of the conservation that's occurring on Maryland agricultural land. There's a section in the middle here, which I'll speak to in a minute, where we think we can gain some additional load reductions. And then finally, this third part of the bar here is looking at future opportunities and how much more can we do out to 2025. So that's really what we focus our effort on back a few months ago when we went out to our local conservation district offices and held local meetings to establish new goals out to 2025. So that middle piece that I was talking about represents a loss in reductions that we think we can regain. And it's the reason I call it a loss is because some of the rules have changed in how we account for practice implementation on agricultural land. So back in the old version of the model and the old way of accounting, if we had reported a waste storage structure that was installed in 1985, we got credit for it in perpetuity. We continue to get credit for it forever. But we all recognize that practices, fail. Farms are sold. Chicken houses may no longer have chickens in them, et cetera. So they established a lifespan for these practices. So we only get a finite amount of credit in the model for those. So with a lot of those old practices that we had installed in the 80s and 90s, we're no longer getting credit for them unless we go out and re-verify that stuff, which basically means we have to put eyes on the ground to make sure that we have those practices on the landscape. So how are we doing? Since October of 2016, we've looked at over 10,000 of those practices on the landscape, and about 73% of them are still out there doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is a great story. 23% no longer exist. Maybe the farm is now a housing development, maybe that old chicken farm is no longer in production, et cetera. Things fail. And then there's 4% that do not meet a standard, meaning that there's something wrong with them that we need to fix. So a great testament to the longevity of a lot of these practices that were installed in the 80s and 90s. So we think we can regain load reductions in the model simply by accounting for all of those old practices. There's some new tools in our toolbox, so here's some new practices that are available to us now to help us close that gap a little bit. And as I mentioned before, we went out to each of the county offices and held public meetings and invited all of the agricultural stakeholders to sit down with us to review the existing plan that we had put in place back in 2011, 2012 timeframe, make sure that the goals that we'd established back then are realistic, and if they're not, let's update them. Some were we overshot what we thought we could do. Some were a lot lower than where we currently are, so there was an opportunity to kind of up our game a little bit to get some additional load reduction. So this was a series of meetings that really, it took us, it was 2 meetings a day on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. Then we went throughout the state, so we were hustling around quite a bit to work through all of these individual meetings. But we started in August, and we finished up towards the middle of September at our last meeting. So it was a round robin throughout the state. But we have individual plans now for the ag sector for each of these counties that we've updated. So we are in the process of compiling all of that information together, and we hope to be able to share it at our regional meetings next week when we start those. So that was a lot in a nutshell. I apologize for going through it very quickly, but I'd be happy to take any questions at the end. So.
Morning, how are you? I'd be happy to talk about oyster aquaculture, but my name is Suzanne Dorsey, and I'm the Executive Director of the Hughes Center. And at the Hughes Center, we represent part of the land grant mission of the University of Maryland, where we really try to address the stakeholder needs of the citizens of Maryland. We work in agriculture and forestry and try to support prosperous farms that are also environmentally sustainable. I have to say that we established a partnership with ALEI, and specifically Sarah, 2 years ago in taking our systems approach to supporting Maryland agriculture and supporting students as well. Allison Venables, who's sitting right here, is one of the interns who worked on this Ag Conservation Leasing Guide. It has been a pleasure and an honor to work with ALEI and Sarah in specific. I've learned a lot, and I feel that this project specifically is doing a lot of good for the citizens of Maryland and the Bay Restoration Project. So just to frame this, following up on Jason's work, this project really addresses that number 3, or those gaps that exist in addressing implementation of best management practices on ag land. The fact of the matter is that in agricultural leasing, 42% of Maryland's agricultural acres are in leases. That means that the farmer that farms them doesn't actually own that property. They either have a verbal relationship with the landowner, or in some rare cases, they actually have a written lease. More and more, our landowners do not live on the land, so they are absent owners. They may live in one of the urban centers and come out to the Eastern Shore or the western part of Maryland on the weekends or seasonally. Very often, there is a lack of communication between the landowner and the farmer, and we believe that that lack of communication is one of the key reasons why we see a much lower rate of conservation practices being implemented on leased land. So, for instance, in 2017, 66% of Maryland's farmland was enrolled in the cover crop program. Only 23% of that was on leased land. So there's a real opportunity for farmers and landowners to make a significant impact in the Bay Restoration Program, and also implement practices that both enhance what the farmer is doing at the same time as increasing the value of that property. So poor communication, lack of understanding, particularly on the landowner side of what these cost share programs are, the bureaucracy of working with federal or state programs, and concern on the farmer side about losing the lease. If you as a farmer invest years in soil fertility and building the organic carbon in that soil, you improve the value of that lease land. Somebody can outbid you for it 1 year, and all that work that you've put into it goes away. So we recognize a real need for farmers and landowners to find a way to come together and talk about what their shared values are and what their goals are for the land. So this project, again, started in partnership with the Hughes Center and ALEI, and because of Sarah's expert grant writing, we were able to leverage the project into a SARE grant, which will enable us to continue this work and share it with our region landowners and practitioners to make sure that they have the tools to communicate with each other. I also want to recognize that we have had 4 interns that have worked on this. In partnership with ALEI, we have an undergraduate at the College of Ag and Natural Resources, and they partner with a law student at the Cary School. So Hannah Catt, Melissa Stefan were our 2017 inaugural Russ Brinsfield summer interns, and this past summer, Danielle Nondorf and Allison Venables were our interns. They've made significant contributions to this work, so we're very pleased to be able to share this work with our students. So the guide, it's an incredible guide. Take time to read it. Make sure that you and your network share this with landowners and practitioners. It's easy to read. It's got up-to-date information about how to engage in conservation when one or both parties are interested. Again, bridging that gap between landowner and farmer. And you know, many of you work in agriculture. They often don't speak the same language. They might have the same goals, but they often don't speak the same language. The guide has resource information and leasing strategies. It's got sample lease language, and I'm a non-legal person. It's understandable. So the way this guide works is it has questions that each party can come together and start a conversation. It guides the relationship between the farmer and the landowner to discuss issues. It explains what the alphabet soup of the federal and state policies are. It carefully walks through tools and questions that landowners and farmers can use to open up a dialogue, and ultimately, if nothing else, have a handshake that incorporates conservation leasing practices. I know my colleague Sarah would much prefer a written lease, and I think that's a great outcome. But from the Hughes Center, we would be pleased if the dialogue begins, because we know from there we're going to see more implementation of practices. Jason's going to be able to count those in his catalog of implementation, and the bay gets cleaner. Our farmers will have more fertile soil, and their yields will increase, as will their profits. So landowners discuss conservation goals. They discuss standards. So, for instance, what are the laws? Who has access to the nutrient management plan? That's something that farmers hold close to their chest. Will the landowner get to see that nutrient management plan? Does the landowner get to see the conservation plan? Who has the right to take soil samples? So if we're increasing soil organic carbon, for instance, will the farmer share that information with the landowner? Or will the landowner go ahead and take on the expense of doing those soil tests, soil samples, and engage in that conversation? Who's in charge of maintenance? So long-term structural practices may need to be maintained over time. So who is it that's going to take on that maintenance? If the lease is 3 years and maintenance requires 10 years, let's have a conversation about how we're going to manage those issues. So Sarah, I'd like to pass it to you so you can talk about the legal aspects of this. And again, it's been a pleasure working with you on this project.
Thank you, Suzanne. So Like Suzanne said, we really advocate that folks start with a simple conversation. You have to understand where each other's coming from, what are the issues on the farm, do you have highly erodible soils that need to be addressed? Is there a part of the farm that's not productive that would be more appropriate for a conservation practice? Once you've reached that consensus, and if you're a landowner, what's your goals for the property? Is this something you're trying to keep in your family, or is this something that you're looking to put on the market in a couple of years? Establish those standards, like Suzanne said, which it's going to have a huge variation depending on the party. Every situation's different. So you could start with something very simple just by including in the lease adhering to nutrient management laws, like she said, and perhaps providing the landowner access to the nutrient management plan if that's something the landowner is interested in, or taking that extra step to go into your local soil conservation district, talk to the folks there, engage in the conservation plan process. I was a roadie on some of the WIP workshops. I was following the regulators around the state a bit and listening to some of the concerns. And it was pretty surprising how many folks in ag don't take advantage of that conservation plan opportunity. It's a free plan. It's highly technical, and it doesn't have to be renewed very often. And it could be a great way for a landowner and a farmer to just start the conversation. Let's look at this plan. This is what the experts have recommended for the property. Do we feel it's appropriate? And if a landowner does feel it's appropriate and wants the farmer to actually implement that, that's just something that should be in a lease. Because if it's not in a lease, that's when legal conflict's going to occur. That's when folks are going to be unhappy, and that's when you run the risk of ruining that leasing relationship. There's some other things in terms of leasing that are also outlined in the guide, excuse me, that are worthy of considering. So I know this isn't always the best option for everybody, but thinking about extending the lease term. A lot of folks are on a year-to-year lease, especially if you're on a handshake, you're on a year-to-year. The farmer's not going to have any incentive to, as Suzanne said, invest in that property. There's just not going to be the stability that's necessary to take that extra step and think beyond just production, but think about long-term health of the soil and conservation. So either extending the lease term or something simple, just like a renewal provision in the lease that will allow for the extension. Graduated rent, if a farmer is going to take a hit, if there's going to be a yield loss, or if the farmer is actually investing in a practice, graduated rent, we have some examples of that in the guide, and that might be appropriate for folks. A depreciation schedule. If you don't want to go ahead and extend that term with your farmer, but the farmer is going to invest in a practice, you can put a simple depreciation schedule into your lease, whereby the farmer would know if this leasing relationship ends, I'll be able to get back my investment at the depreciated level. And then division of cost share funding. So in many cases, we heard from folks across the state that the landowners get really excited about conservation at some point. They go ahead and they sign up for cost share funding, and they put that conservation practice on the land, and they say, okay, farmer, can you take care of that on top of everything else you're doing in a really, really bad year like we're having this year with tons of rain where you can hardly get out in the field at all? And that starts to build some resentment and some negative attitudes about incorporating conservation onto farms. So if a farmer's being asked to do something above and beyond and they're not getting a part of that cost share funding, that's a consideration. Think about whether or not that farmer's entitled to some of that cost share funding and whether that should be in the lease. So in the guide, like Suzanne said, we do have some sample lease provisions. You should always go visit your individual attorney. It's not substitute for legal advice, but it's just some samples to get folks thinking. For the most commonly used conservation practices. So this is an example of some language that we've provided for a riparian buffer. So outlining the restrictions, making it extremely clear what the farmer's not permitted to do in that conservation practice area. Putting that out in the lease at the forefront is going to eliminate misunderstandings in the future and hopefully preserve the relationship. If you're asking that tenant to take on those maintenance responsibilities, be extremely clear with what that tenant is supposed to be doing in that area. If the landowner's the one who's applied for cost share, they're the one that's going to be at risk of having a financial consequence if that's not maintained properly. So making sure that that's abundantly clear in the lease. And then again, just a sample of how you could structure dividing some of that cost share funding if that's part of the equation. So yes, we did get a SARE grant. Thank you to the USDA for that. And so we're going on our own roadshow this winter. We're going to be having conservation leasing workshops, and it's kicking off with a webinar on November 15th. That's next week. Please tune in if you're interested. As you can see, we're going to be going all around the state. These workshops are for agriculture service providers, so we can't do this alone as ALEI, especially after today. We're going to be tired. But so we're asking for ag service providers, Extension, NRCS, Land Trust folks, anyone who works with the farming community, welcome to come out to these workshops. And then we're also inviting the farming community themselves, both landowners and farmers, to come attend. We're dragging Jason along with us. He can't escape, so he's going to come talk about why this is so important and why we need folks to tune into this and make some changes. And we're also going to be going through in detail all the resources that are available and how this can work on the ground in Maryland. And we're not going to leave folks alone. We'll be here. We're providing 2 years of technical support following the workshop series and the workshop series, and then future education that the service providers will be doing are all eligible for nutrient management credits, thanks to the Department of Agriculture. So, thank you. I think now we'll take questions.
How do these agricultural conservation leasing practices work when the landowner is the county or the state?
So, I mean, we have talked to some folks from DNR. DNR actually has a great lease. I love DNR's lease. I would consider it a conservation lease because it holds farmers to a really high standard. I think the practices in the guide are very similar to the things that are in the current DNR lease that I've seen, and so they could easily be adopted by a state or a county.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I was recently talking to somebody from U.S. Fish and Wildlife and found out that U.S. Fish and Wildlife does lease land through a handshake, our federal government through a handshake with farmers. And the other issue that is really relevant, when we talk to DNR farmers who lease land from the DNR, and we ask them what would encourage you to implement more conservation practices, do you want a cheaper lease? What is it? And they said, no certainty, 5 year, give us a 5-year lease. DNR was thrilled because very often when they rebid out their leases, they lose money just as often as they make money. So this can be a real win-win scenario if you build in conservation practices to a lease. And very simply, just by adding certainty to a farmer, you can satisfy both the farmer and the landowner's conservation goals.
Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much to our panelists. Could you please? Oh, I'm sorry.
Hi. I've talked to some farmers who have expressed some concerns about foreign ownership of the land, people not in this country, particularly China. And so how have you encountered working with that kind of owners on these kind of issues?
I too have heard that. I have not had that opportunity yet, although I know that there is a farmer who will be on a panel at the Midshore workshop who's had that exact experience. I would hope, since this is a publicly available resource, and we're doing our best to try to educate this ag and environmental community, that those folks would be able to take advantage of this as well.
Very, very often those foreign landowners are represented by a land manager who can be the intermediate to ensure that these practices are installed. Again, it adds value. It's building the value of your land resource. So there's a good incentive for foreign investors to participate in this.
But I think it's a good point, and I do think we need to make sure we clue in the realtor community involved with this as well, because I know the realtors are often involved with that interface during the purchase with the farmer.
We have one more question.
So again, a very informative presentation. I was wondering, these workshops that you all listed, are the tenant farmers, landowners, and nutrient management specialists. Is that a platform that brings them together? Because public education goes, when we have policies in the books, without that public knowledge and education and bringing everybody together, it can be tough to implement. My point is that happening in those workshops, or is that the intention to happen? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely. We're trying to, I mean, in a perfect world, we would have landowner-farmer pairs, but we're trying to pull in exactly what you said, the ag service professionals who work on nutrient management plans. I'm going to be speaking about this at the Nutrient Management Conference in December in Laurel. Yes, definitely. I think we're trying to get all three of these communities, so to speak, to understand the need for this and give them the tools so that they can succeed in implementing it.
And specific invitations have gone out to encourage that landowner-farmer pair to attend, but I'll ask you in this room, with your connections, you too can help ensure that those pairings happen. We know that when one landowner farmer have a good experience through writing a lease and implementing conservation, that spreads rapidly through the community. So I would appeal to you today to make a phone call, and if there is somebody that's in the land trust or in the realty or that is a landowner who leases to farmers, that they attend one of these meetings. So we would appreciate your help in that effort.
Matt.
Last question.
Thank you for the presentation. This is for Jason. How do you see new partnerships playing into phase 3 of the WIP for the agricultural sector? And do you feel that current cost share incentives are adequate enough to get us over that line?
Sure. So one thing that was really beneficial when we went out to the county meetings and held those meetings with local ag stakeholders, there was a lot of non-governmental organizations there represented as well. So their participation, their input in this process was vital, because we all need to work together at this. Many of those organizations are actually working with the ag community to install a lot of these practices as well. So we need to, it's really all hands on deck to get those practices installed. So yes, that was very, very important for us, and we will continue to engage with those folks moving forward, whether it's providing support with grant opportunities or things of that sort that might become available. In terms of cost share, our traditional max cost share program, we anticipate continuing to fund that at current levels. We're looking at opportunities to enhance that, maybe changing the suite of practices, including additional practices that will be eligible, those types of things. So absolutely, we're looking at all of that. Yeah.
Do we have time for one more?
Just very quickly, for an innovative practice, a BMP that's not approved right now, we're looking at one, and we have found it very difficult to even figure out who will work with us on getting it certified through the Agriculture Department as best management practice. So I'd like to talk to someone about that.
Sure. So there's a number of different avenues in which a practice can be recognized, if you will, in terms of load reduction credit to the model. So certainly having scientific research to support those practices, those types of things. So working with local land grant universities, the Natural Resources Conservation Service under the USDA has a conservation innovation grant program that helps provide some funding to research some of these projects. So once the research has done, and similar research has been done maybe in other areas, what will happen, or what can happen, is through the Bay program partnership, an expert panel can be formed to review that practice, and they would establish an efficiency that we could then ultimately get credit for in the model and report against. So. Sure. So the department would actually ask the Chesapeake Bay program, hey, this is a practice that we think is beneficial to the agricultural community. Can we establish an expert panel to review it? So they will essentially put out a request for experts to review the literature that's been or the research that's been conducted on those practices, and they would determine what type of credit we could get for that. Right. Yeah.
Join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you.